Hey everyone, it's Thursday, February 21st, and today I'd like to talk to you about the situation in the West African Republic of Mali. I want to talk about it because I think it's interesting, I think it's important, I think it's been criminally underreported in the United States. And also I think it says a lot about what gets reported in the United States and how it gets reported. I'm also interested because it reminds me of the last time that the French intervened in one of their former colonies in order to stop the spread of an unpopular ideology. So the Republic of Mali is a landlocked country in West Africa with a population of around 16 million people. Mali has a really interesting pre-colonial history, and it helped make West Africa what it is, culturally at least. Between 12 and 1600, Mali was one of the richest empires in the world. For instance, one of its rulers, Mansa Musa, when he went on the Hajj in 1324, spent so much money on the trip that it caused runaway inflation everywhere he went. That inflation lasted for decades in Alexandria, Egypt. Also, his entourage for this trip included 60,000 people, which was more than the entire population of London in 1324. So that empire fell apart in the 1600s into a bunch of smaller successor kingdoms, with their own uninteresting dynastic struggles that lasted for the next couple hundred years. This all ended when Mali was colonized by the French in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It's an archetypal example of how countries were split up by Europeans during the scramble for Africa. There are ethnic Taurigs in the east and Moorish Berbers in the north, and a very slim man majority in the south, where the cities are. So after the whole decolonization thing happened for them in 1968, Mali tried being a socialist republic, then had a military coup, and a counter-coup, and counter-coups. And finally, in 1991, after mass protests involving the army and the populace, Mali finally became a constitutional democracy. Yay! But for real, I think it's important to recognize that Mali, as an independent nation, is younger than my parents. And as a democracy, if it were a person, would be a college senior. So anyway, the Tories have been fighting on and off against the man majority for the better part of a century, but the current conflict started in January of 2012. What's different this time is that when the fighting broke out between the Separatists and the government, al-Qaeda's African branch jumped into the fighting like, "Woo! Fighting! Let's get some! Yeah!" and started fighting with the Separatists against the government. But then the Separatists were like, "Whoa! Al-Qaeda? Oh, no." The Separatists wanted nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, who almost immediately started imposing strict Sharia law in the areas that they controlled. So the Separatists and the Islamists both started fighting each other, while both sides were still fighting the government. This turn would have been really good for the government, except they did an exceptionally bad job of mismanaging the conflict. And because of the anger over that mismanagement, there was a military coup against the national government in March of 2012. They forced the president and most of his cabinet out of the country and suspended the constitution. Incidentally, the people throwing the coup called themselves the National Committee for the Restoration of Democracy in the State, which sounds exactly like the opposite of what they were doing. So anyway, the government pulled troops out of northern Mali so it could fight itself, and the Separatists and the Islamists and some new interesting splinter groups made significant gains and captured almost all of northern Mali. This happened, by the way, despite the fact that all these groups are fighting each other, and in some cases themselves. So this whole situation with Mali about to completely fall apart is problematic to other West African nations and also to France because, sure, France. So France and a half dozen West African countries intervened in January of 2013. This did nothing to simplify the situation. Some of the separatists were fighting with the government and with the French. Some were fighting against the government. There was some intergovernmental fighting with troops loyal to the old regime, fighting troops loyal to the new regime. And all this time, the constitution was still suspended. Regardless, by the end of January, it looked like the French and other foreign forces had crushed the Islamists and the Taureg Separatists were lying low. But then, earlier this month, the fighting broke out again with a more kind of al-Qaeda-y feel to it. Despite some pretty dramatic fighting and suicide bombings in Gao, the majority of the fighting has been going on in the mountains in northern Mali, which the BBC called perfect for guerrillas. And Islamist and French and separatist forces have all taken part in the fighting. The whole thing looks like it could end up being a lot more intractable than anyone thought it would be, and it could end up involving a lot more troops from a lot more different countries. For example, a group of soldiers from the UK's Royal Irish Regiment has been diverted from their planned deployment to Afghanistan to go to Mali. So why hasn't this received a lot of media attention in the United States? It's complicated. And not that it's complicated that it hasn't received a lot of media attention in the United States. It hasn't received a lot of media attention in the United States because it's complicated. See, it's important to remember that US media programs are designed to be profitable and to be entertaining, and they do this by creating a consistent, easy-to-follow narrative for their viewers. So stories like this, where there are no easily identifiable good guys or bad guys, and the story changes in ways that are complicated and don't fit any of our preset narratives, don't get a lot of coverage in the United States. Also, to be fair, I think it's in part because a lot of people in America don't pay much attention to what happens in Africa, despite the fact that it contains 1 billion of the Earth's people, is larger in size than India, the United States, and all of Europe put together. But I think the first point really speaks to the problem you can have when you live in a country where most of the news is made for profit. News shows report on certain stories not because they are important, but because they will get and they will keep viewers. I think the situation in Mali is important, and I think it's worth paying attention to. So that's my take on the situation. If you thought this was entertaining or informative, or you want me to do more of these, let me know in comments or on Facebook. Peace.